Let's learn about cells. Cells are the basic building blocks of all life. Cells make up all living things. We can start off with a single cellular or a unicellular living organism such as a bacteria or a protist, and then there are multicellular, many-celled organisms such as a human. Okay, we're made up of many different cells. So unicellular, uni meaning one, multi meaning many. We're going to start off with basic matter. You need to know what an atom is. Atoms consist of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons and neutrons are in the nucleus of the atom. Electrons go around that nucleus. Atoms then combine to form molecules or compounds. So an atom, which would make up like an element. Okay, if we have two or more elements, we're going to have a molecule, which could be different, okay, or same, but a compound is generally going to be different elements. Atoms make up elements, which then make up compounds. Some molecules and compounds that you need to know would be carbohydrates. An example of a carbohydrate is sugar. Lipids, you need to know the word lipid. Lipid means fat. So just a common name for lipid would be a fat. Proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids. And then the last one, nucleic acids, you will need to know is another name for DNA or RNA. So DNA and RNA are examples of nucleic acids. And all of these things are found and they build up and they're used to build cells. And we already talked about the cell theory. The cell theory does start off with ideas of Schleiden and Schwann. Came up with this cell theory and they used the knowledge of other scientists such as Robert Hooke, who first observed cells, specifically cork cells, cork from trees, the bark, and so basically, or the cork cambium of the tree. And so Robert Hooke looked at the cells of cork under the microscope. Then Schleiden and Schwann used this information to come up with the basic ideas of the cell theory, which is all living things are made up of cells and produce cells, and then other cells come from pre-existing cells. So a cell cannot just come from nothing. Okay, cellular function. All cells use energy. And we'll be talking about ATP. We're going to be talking about metabolism. All cells make materials to use for itself and for the whole organism. And then cells have a stimuli or a response to the environment. And all cells will reproduce some way. And this could be the process of mitosis or meiosis, binary fission or budding. Now let's talk about cell organelles. An organelle is like a tiny little organ. It's an organized structure inside each cell that has a specific specialized purpose. It's like a tiny little organ. An organ in our body has a function, it has a shape. In the same way, an organelle has a specific shape and a specific function. Let's go back and be reminded what a eukaryote cell is. A eukaryote cell has a nucleus. It has membrane-bound organelles. Now remember, a prokaryote cell is like a bacterial cell. Bacteria cells don't have these organelles. They don't have a nucleus. So we're not going to focus on bacterial cells since this title, this part of the chapter, is dealing with organelles. So we're going to focus on the eukaryote. The start of the eukaryote cell we're going to focus on is cytoplasm. Cytoplasm and cytosol are very similar. It's pretty much the same thing except when it's talking about what does it hold, what's in it. So cytoplasm is the fluid of the cell that holds and surrounds the organelles. So if we're talking about the fluid with the organelles, that's cytoplasm. Cytosol, however, is just the fluid. Okay, when we're not talking about the organelles, if we're just talking about the fluid, it's cytosol. If we're talking about the fluid and the organelles around it, it would be cytoplasm. So they're pretty much the same thing. It's just two different names for the same fluid, but it's in relation. Are we talking about there are organelles around it, or are we talking about it with the organelles? If yes, we call it cytoplasm. If we're just talking about the fluid, it would be called cytosol. So don't get confused by those. It's pretty much the same thing. The cell membrane. The cell membrane is made up of two layers. It's called the phospholipid bilayer. Bi, think of bicycle. Bi means two. And this layer, these two layers, are made up of phosphates, phospho, and lipids. And remember, what are lipids? Fats. So the phosphate part is a head, and this head loves water. So we call it hydrophilic. Think of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. So hydro meaning water, philic meaning love. The phosphate head loves water. The lipid tail hates water. So we call it hydro, water, phobic, meaning afraid of. So the lipid tail hates water and it wants to get away. So that's going to be very important in the structural formation of the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. So the lipid tails are always going to be on the inside touching each other, while the phosphate heads are going to be on the outside. And we can actually see a picture of that here. Okay, we see the little heads, okay, the circles on the outside, that's the phosphate, and those little legs are the two tails. Okay, those little legs are the lipid or fatty acid tails. But you also have a little blue thing going through the cell membrane, and that is called the integral protein, and it acts as a gate, okay, to transfer proteins, to transfer different things through it. So it acts as a little bridge or a gate. Here again, we have the phosphate heads, the lipid tails, and the integral protein or the gate. Now let's move on to the nucleus. The nucleus is the the nucleus is the brain of the cell. The nucleus contains DNA. There's usually only one nucleus per cell. In some protists, there are two nuclei. Some fungi may have more than one nucleus, but generally we only have one nucleus per cell. The nucleus contains a nucleus within it called the micronucleus, or the nucleolus. The nucleus can easily be seen under the microscope and usually contains a double layer. Okay, the cytoskeletons. The cytoskeletons provide support, shape, and structure, and that's why they're called a skeleton, to provide shape for the cell. It also helps organelles move throughout the cell. There are three different types of cytoskeletons, microtubules being the bigger, thicker ones. Then you have intermediate, meaning middle, and then microfilaments called actin are the real thin, small ones. And here's a picture. The actin filaments are the thinnest. Ribosomes. Ribosomes are the site of protein synthesis, or synthesis referring to making. So this is the place where proteins are made. So we will be talking about ribosomes when we talk about RNA. There's something called an R, or ribosomal RNA, and we'll learn about that later. But ribosomes may just float in the cytosol or the cytoplasm, or they may be attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, the ER. And if they're attached to another organelle, they're called a bound ribosome. Okay, the ER, what I just talked about, if it's called a bound or rough ribosome, it would be attached to the ER. So there we have the rough ER has ribosomes attached to it. The smooth ER does not have ribosomes attached to it. And the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER, basically acts as a subway system or a highway throughout the cell. And it connects to the nucleus. So that picture has the ribosomes on it, so that would be the rough ER. So we have the rough ER and then the smooth ER. Rough ER on the left, smooth ER on the right. Now the Golgi body, which is also called the Golgi complex, or the Golgi apparatus. So there are 3 separate names for it, but it's still the same thing. So you may go to a different school, read a different textbook, or go online. It may not say Golgi body. It may say Golgi complex, or it may say Golgi apparatus, but it's still the same thing. Now, the purpose of the Golgi is to accept, package, wrap things up, and send it out, just like the Postal Service, okay? Just like UPS or FedEx. So the main focus of the Golgi is to package, store, modify, change proteins, and send them out. And the Golgi body looks like this little squishy thing. Okay, lysosomes. Lysosomes, basically the purpose here is to break down cells. If something is dead, lysosomes will be opened up to release all these enzymes to break down the cell. That way we don't have dead bodies all over the place. The dead body starts to rot. Okay? So lysosomes contain enzymes, kind of like acid, that will break down food, that will break down the cell, okay, that will break down different structures in the cell. Okay, the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the power plant, the power station of the cell. It will have the ATP, which we talked about previously. It will release energy for the cell to use, and it does have a double layer or double membrane. Vacuoles. Vacuoles act as a storage container. There could be a food vacuole, which stores what? Food. There can be a water vacuole, which stores what? Water. There could be a waste vacuole, which stores waste. Okay, so plant cells usually have a larger vacuole, central vacuole, which mainly holds water. Animal cells usually have many small vacuoles. Okay, then we have centrioles, and this is going to tie into our mitosis and meiosis unit dealing with cell division. The centrioles are microtubules, which we said are these thicker ones that actually help the animal cell to divide. It splits the DNA, the chromosomes, in 2. Okay, and you can see them, one on the left, one on the right at the poles. Those 2 little things are the microtubules. Okay, chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are mainly only found in plant cells. Some protists have it as well. They are green because they contain a green color pigment called chlorophyll. And basically the purpose of the chloroplast is to take sunlight and to turn it into food. Okay, so instead of the plants eating other things, they're not eating other things. Most plants don't, except your Venus flytrap and a couple others. But primarily your plants are going to not be eating other things, but they're going to take the sunlight, the chloroplast, breaks it down, and then turns it into food. And then the plant can store the food in the roots. And so that's why the leaves are green, because of the chlorophyll and the chloroplast. Okay, the cell wall. The cell wall is a extra layer around the cell membrane. So animal cells just have a cell membrane. Plant cells have a cell wall. Now, plant cells are not always going to be rectangular, but they're going to be more rigid. And that's primarily because of the cell wall. The cell wall contains something called cellulose, and the cellulose is a strong material that prevents us from breaking down the cell and getting all the nutrients from it. That's why if we eat broccoli when it's raw, it tastes different from when it's cooked. When we cook the broccoli or we cook the carrot, we break down the cell wall. Okay, plants versus animal cells. You can kind of see the difference in the vacuole. You can see some of the different structures. Plant cells do have a chloroplast where animal cells do not. Plants do have a cell wall where animals do not.